Kia ora koutou katoa. Welcome to The Hoon, where co-host Peter Bale and I go around the week's news in geopolitics and Aotearoa's political economy with a whole bunch of experts, academics and politicians, all to understand our worlds better and have some fun. Tēnā koutou katoa, everyone. Welcome on to The Hoon. I am Bernard Hickey for the Kaka. I'm the co-host. Here back at home at Waiheke Island with Peter Bale, fellow co-host.
Also back at home. Yeah.
Back at home across the bay in Hoon Bay.
Yes, but Bernard, I haven't been for a swim and you have. I'm so impressed that you went for a swim because I've said to you before, possibly, but maybe not to our full audience. I want to be one of those old ladies that I see. I mean, when I say old ladies, I know I'm an old man, but those people who swim from one end of the bay to another at any hour or day of the year. And I'm so impressed. I want to be that person.
Yeah, no, I'm blessed that every morning at 7 o'clock, me and a bunch of other people leap into the sea near where I live, and we freeze our bikes off.
You commune, yeah.
And it's the best.
Are you
thing
still
ever.
doing it naked, Bernard, in that time of the year?
Yes, it's much easier. And
sorry, Simon will have to edit that out.
That's right. So it's a wonderful thing because it's a bit of community, it's a bit of nature, it's a bit of fun, it's a bit of like completely abandoned, do something stupid and silly fun every day.
Yes.
And every day it's different because
I think you need that. I think being a very serious chap, Bernard, you need that stupid and silly thing to do. And I was intending I apologize again to our audience for the noisy place that I stupidly chose to do who could imagine that a church would be taken over by a bar unexpectedly in Nelson?
Could it be the beer in the bar in the corner?
Yes, it might be that. But I went to Lake Rotuiti in the Nelson Lakes after that, and I did a really gorgeous run around the lake, partly around the wreck. I am building up to run the full 18 kilometres, but I've just felt ashamed the whole weekend that despite having taken my wetsuit, I did not, in fact, immerse myself in the lake. Because for me, it's a kind of sacred place where if I immerse myself in the lake, I'm absolved from, anything bad I've done ever.
Yeah, nature works, nature heals. It's wonderful, and the more we can have, the better. And hopefully, we can keep what we've got and make what we've got a little bit.
Yeah,
better.
but I think, Bernard, given your workload, and just to be nice, I am always nice to you and feed you from time to time and so on. Given your workload and the slight weirdness of the way you of your
schedule,
your the way that you work very late at night into the morning. For that,
very early in the morning,
yeah. To go and have a swim, to go and be liberated, and it's fantastic.
No,
I also have seen some excellent pictures of your beach glass collection from Waiheke.
That's my other little obsession. This is where I exposed myself on the spectrum.
What?
Just completely obsessed and dissolved in my hunting for little bits of glass to line up and organise when I get home. There's the dirty little secret of me. I am obsessed by collecting sea glass and organising it into very well-ordered pots.
I think it's actually very. I've got every time you come, I forget to show you my little pieces of sea glass. David Mooring's asking who's hammering, and again, I do apologise. It's just because, as I read in Bernard's Substack today, we have a housing market with an economy attached. My building is being redone a little bit, and Gary Moore says we sound like two Auckland wankers. Okay. He's a Waiheke wanker and I'm an Auckland wanker.
We must have Gary on from Christchurch at some point.
Is he? Gary on from Christchurch, yeah. He was really rude to me last week too. But anyway, there's some scaffolding on my building, and while I love the scaffolders, who weirdly are all from the Philippines.
It's actually not very weird and not very unusual.
This is bringing us back to the housing market with the
bits stacked on.
Exactly.
The bits scaffolded on. So did you hear that? That was good. So the news. Before we jump into the big news of geopolitics, I just wanted to point out something that was incredibly encouraging and made me feel good, which was to hear that Anne Telnaes, who is the only recently fired cartoonist at the Washington
Well, she
Post.
resigned. She resigned
She
after one
resigned.
of her cartoons was rejected. Yes, please
Yep.
continue.
Who has launched a Substack, and a very successful launch it was too,
Mm-hmm.
has just been awarded the Pulitzer Prize for editorial cartooning. And what I found fascinating was that the Washington Post bragged about it, even though,
Well, it was for her. Look, so let's just be clear about this because it is quite important. Well, sort of important because we try to dispense with our media chat in this little first bit. So Ann Tamlis did win the Pulitzer Prize, and it was for the 2024 cartoons. But the Pulitzer Committee added that she'd shown fearlessness that led to her departure from the news organization after 17 years. And this is the person, always very difficult to do cartoons on a podcast, either audibly or with pictures, but she drew the now famous or infamous cartoon of the tech oligarchs, including, unfortunately, her boss, Jeff Bezos, abasing themselves in front of the emperor. And the cartoon was stopped by the head of comment at the Washington Post, who has also since gone. But the point that you made to me actually the other day was kind of interesting, Bernard, and from a media point of view, was my friend, possibly former friend, Will Lewis, who's the CEO and publisher of the Washington Post, apparently, reportedly, which is one of the weasel words, did not go down into the newsroom to celebrate the several Pulitzer Prizes that the Washington Post won. And, that place is in trouble. I mean, mind you, it is it's an august institution, but Will has a few other things on his mind, which we've talked about before, but, which we haven't lately talked about, which is the Gordon Brown threat to get the Metropolitan Police to investigate Will's role in destroying many, many millions of emails at News Limited. So this is not going to go away. And much as I admire and find Will incredibly funny and amusing, some of this dark stuff that is attached to one's loyalty to Rupert Murdoch is going to catch up on one, I suspect.
And it is great to see, people standing up and taking risks and, hurting their own livelihoods to call out the watering down, the diversion, the deflection of a free press in the United States. Not just Anne, there have been many others who have done that. And including at CBS News, 60 Minutes, a long-time producer there, left with a very dignified and clear statement that he didn't feel he could continue to do his job while his bosses at CBS were basically trying to suck up to Donald Trump to get a big merger over the line. And the journalists at 60 Minutes came out publicly and said that. And it's great to see that people are standing up.
Within reason. I thought it was very, because I mean, the Shari Redstone, who is the daughter of, oh God, I've just forgotten his name, Mr. Redstone, who famously had Sumner Redstone, who had famously had second-degree burns on his hands, which affected him for the rest of his life, because a hotel that he was in with his mistress caught fire, and he hung on the windowsill of the hotel, and the flames licked his hands, and he would show them to people as an indication of his strength. Anyway, Shari is trying to sell Paramount to Larry Ellison's son. And, Trump does control this. But he's suing CBS for $20 billion because of this alleged doctored interview with Kamala Harris. I mean, but not very many people are all standing up, Bernard. And I thought it was very interesting. I don't know the story yet, but we can maybe look into it and I'll talk about it next week, perhaps. It was very interesting to me that Joe Biden gave his first interview since leaving the presidency to the BBC, to Nick Robinson of the Today Show. And I suspect, but I don't know, that is because most other US broadcasters either didn't ask or did not want to be the ones to carry the Joe message. because of potential retribution from Trump.
Yeah, and interesting too to see the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists. I think they won a Pulitzer this year and have just finished an amazing investigation with the cooperation of Stuff into the way that China has used Interpol as a tool to suppress political opponents in other countries. And it is great to see these independent operators really stepping up where they can. ProPublica as well in the United
Yeah, well, as
States.
you remember, Bernard, the on this Pulitzer thing, not that it was my Pulitzer, it was the ICIJ's Pulitzer, but I did not hesitate to go into the newsroom when the ICIJ won the Pulitzer for the Panama Papers. Even though it was not my project, it was their project, but I was responsible for them at the time, and you just have to honour these people when they do it. Speaking of which, here's Catherine.
We're really pleased to see you, Catherine. Lovely to have you on from windy, wild Wellington and talking all about climate because there's plenty of it there. And also in particular, let's start off with a slightly US theme today. We've got news news out of the United States that bird flu, which has caused all sorts of grief, increased egg prices, apart from anything else, is it's on its way, and it's of course influenced by climate change. Can you talk about bird flu a bit?
Yeah, so they're seeing bird flu. One of the interesting things about what's emerging in the US at the moment is we've known for a long while that it's been affecting, chickens and flocks and things, but it's also affecting dairy herds at the moment. And there's a suggestion that the consolidation of farming into much bigger herds in smaller places is having an impact on that, making it more likely that those diseases will spread through there. And there's also been some suggestion just recently that whereas they thought up until recently that it was being spread through the air, through respiration in dairy herds, they're now thinking that it might be being spread through milking equipment and even through milk itself. And so, and one of the issues that we're seeing at the moment in the US is the lack of information that's traveling, through networks and particularly people who are working with these dairy animals. Often, you have workers that are immigrants and that don't speak English well, and so they're not getting information. They're not going to visit doctors when they have the flu
Because they're worried about being deported. Yep.
Yeah, so there's all sorts of issues in the US that could cause it to become more of an active outbreak amongst humans. They've had, I think, 50 or 60 cases of humans having it in the US and only one death so far. But there's definitely some concerning signs going on there. And the link I wanted to make also to this, around climate change, is, we know that there's something like 50% of human pathogens are exacerbated by climate change. So there is a climate change relationship to a lot of these things going on. Some of the things that can cause that are things like if there's stress around natural ecosystems, around biodiversity, it can turn something that is a background kind of mild pathogen can become much higher, more pathogenic. So it becomes that it can cause much worse diseases and that spread more quickly, and I think that that's what's happened with bird flu in particular. So that can then move it into populations that are closer to human contact. But also it can be things like extreme weather events and flooding can cause the outbreaks of epidemics, even things like cholera and stuff like that follow on from some of those.
But Catherine, cholera only happens in poor countries.
Well, this is the problem in places like America where they've not only let their infrastructure fall, but Trump has fired a whole bunch of the experts who are supposed to monitor and hopefully come up with quick responses that make sense. And this is the other thing. One of the amazing achievements of COVID during COVID was the cooperation between many countries' scientists and their public health authorities. And of course, the United States, the biggest in the world, so it played a major role, was very connected to a lot of those pharmaceutical companies. That meant that we could all come up with those vaccines very fast, including connections to the Chinese, industry and information. And as opaque and dictatorial as the Chinese are and how they wanted to control the information flow, they were cooperating and sending data. But the way Trump is essentially wrecking the information establishment around science and public health is just absolutely awful. Now, speaking of climate change and how it's affecting us, we've got news that New Zealand is special in the great oceans because a lot of the heat is starting to gather around us. Could you talk about what's happening with marine heat waves?
Yeah, so there was a really great article in Newsroom in the last couple of weeks from Kevin Trenberth about some research that he's been involved in, which is looking at links between atmospheric heating and what's happening with surface temperatures and oceans. So they're able to kind of, huge models looking at a lot more of the interactions that are going on there. And a couple of the things that they've been finding is one, storm tracks are moving towards the poles at both ends of the earth, and we've seen that with more storms hitting New Zealand. But the other one is some of the action of the way that trade winds operate is piling up heat in ocean surface temperatures, and where we're seeing it pile up mostly in the southern hemisphere is between 40 and 45 degrees latitude in the southern hemisphere, and that happens to be exactly the latitude that New Zealand sits at.
No wonder I can go swimming in the morning in the middle of winter.
I was going to say there is an upside to this, which is that Bernard's testicles are still attached to him, and his nipples haven't broken off after his swim this morning. But
I mean that has a whole lot. I mean, quite apart from the impacts that it has on the marine ecosystem, it also interacts with the weather. So the interactions move both ways and has an effect on, or it has an effect on things like sea level as well, but also on the weather events that hit New Zealand. And so on that note as well, just before I left the office this afternoon, I got an email about something from NIWA. They're releasing a new interactive game, which sounds really fascinating. It's to do with flooding events and coastal. It's called Coastal Futures Aotearoa, and it's also going to form part of a citizen science project where people's interactions within the game will then be at their psychological or behaviour responses will be analysed if they can get enough people playing it. So I think this is, it sounds, it's right up my alley. It sounds fascinating.
Yeah.
I haven't had a chance to play around with it yet, but I think it's something that maybe you might cover in the CARC, or something we'll have a bit more of a look at and talk about next week.
I think that's a great idea. We'll put a link in the show notes that go out with this podcast to that. And it's one of those SimCities, risk role-playing games that could easily be a lot of fun. All you need to do is add in some weapons, and there's a shoot 'em up too. Whoever's,
if you could lay that in on top, that'd be great.
That's right.
So we've seen
coastal
real,
waters around the
all
beehive.
the climate deniers.
Catherine, we've seen real impact on this. Even I think we may have mentioned this because I think that the Hoon has now been going nearly 3 years, possibly more, which is ridiculous. But the mussel farms in Marlborough have now had to move out and the salmon farms are having to move out because they can't to the Cook Strait and so on, and to bigger because of this warming. It's having a significant impact.
It has really profound impacts in the water itself, but also on land in terms of the weather systems that we see. So it's a big deal for Aotearoa, for people to understand how it's going to affect you in the places that you live, and what kind of decision making needs to be made politically around that as well. So, yeah.
Catherine, I was struck. Bernard, are you wanting to bring in Robert, or can I?
No, go for it.
The appointment of a science advisor this week, Brian Roach, who I don't think I realised was a scientist. Perhaps he is.
Not Brian Roach. I think there's another Roach.
Oh, is it another Roach?
Let me get the
Oh,
exact
it
name
will get.
for you.
They'll be in the Roach Motel. I do
No,
apologise.
no.
I just listened to it and I thought, Christ, he's the minister for everything.
They may well be related.
Yeah.
And I will tell you, John Roach is his name.
Okay, I do apologise. No. All right. Entire storyline removed there. But I noticed the person we had on from the New Zealand Science Professionals group some months ago noted that three of the six, I think, are dairy people. What did you make of the appointment of our new science group?
To be honest, I'm not really up to speed with it, so I don't have a lot to comment on it. But
from that never stops us, right? We just
never stops.
walk, we talk on through.
Yeah. But what I would say is that this government could certainly do with some decent science advice, because some of the decisions that have been coming out from the government over the last year have been not terribly well based on evidence. And the appointment of science advisors has been a long time coming. Like, it didn't happen as quickly as it should have. So any action in that space is a good sign from my point of view. It might have been Troy Bayston that you were talking to, perhaps, about the...
Yes, I'll put a link to Troy's full statement about this, but there has been some commentary in the science community about the links of Dr. John Roach to the dairy industry. He comes into it having worked as the Chief Science Advisor for Dairy NZ for quite some time, and three of the members of the new panel approached are from the farming company's background. So, yeah, it's worth challenging, and I'll put a full link to that Troy Bayston.
And my grovelling apologies for connecting Brian Roach and Roach.
No, I did think Brian Roach as soon as I saw that name, and of course my initial impression was, gee, I wonder if they're related. But we'll find out.
Well, yeah, which is New Zealand, so almost certainly. Speaking of which, here's Professor Robert Patman from Otago University,
Good evening.
Head of
Hi,
International Affairs. How are you?
Good, thank you.
Lovely to see you, Robert.
It's
Good to
been
see you
another
guys.
bonkers week in the world, and we hear that Donald Trump.
Thank
is
you,
going to
Catherine,
the-
by the way. Sorry.
Thank you,
Lovely to see
Catherine.
Bye, Catherine.
Do stay on if you want to. That Trump is going to the Middle East next week, essentially to the Gulf states at the moment, which is, Qatar, UAE, and Saudi Arabia. But it wouldn't surprise me if there was a dogleg, an unofficial dogleg, an undeclared dogleg to Jerusalem. But the idea is, one of the things he will rename the Persian Gulf as the Gulf of Arabia. Did you see that, Robert?
Yes, I did. And just as he's trying to negotiate a breakthrough deal with Iran, obviously,
What could possibly go wrong?
What possibly could go wrong? He's reading the room nicely as usual. He's also, the thing about this is that it's done as a bit of a sweetener, I suppose, for the Arab states. But he renaming the Persian Gulf, calling it the Arab Gulf, in Mr. Trump's mind, will somehow overcome many of the Gulf states' concerns about his policy in Gaza. Well, of course it won't.
And that policy became much clearer and frankly more awful this week when Israel basically said, right, we're actually going to invade it and take it and flatten it and push all the people out.
Yeah, well, they got the green light essentially from, the moment Mr. Trump said he wanted to annex Gaza, and he couldn't foresee the Palestinians, the residents of the territory, staying there. That was effectively a green light for their forcible eviction, and Israel. That clearly delighted Mr. Netanyahu, who's now. He sees that as the green light, I think, for what he wants to do. Meanwhile,
but when you say green lighted, I mean, this has been all very quiet, but everybody's making assumptions that there is a green light. But there certainly seems to be a green light, and we're now seeing the obliteration, it seems to me, of civilian populations in Gaza, and this whole idea. You've got Smotrich talking now about them just not being there. There's like a permission being given, but we're not actually being told what the reality is. What are you seeing or hearing that justifies that?
it's more of the same, and it's not a recent thing. It's been going on now for 18 months, with a short ceasefire, which was only agreed to by the Israelis because of great pressure from Steve Witkoff, apparently, who threatened Netanyahu. But of course, Israel unilaterally broke the ceasefire and did not incur the displeasure of Washington. So Washington looks very weak. Anything to do, it doesn't seem to have any leverage at all in some respects with Israel. In fact, Mr. Trump said at the beginning of his administration, he was, as far as he's concerned, Netanyahu should just finish the job. So, yeah, the contours of what seems to be America's connivance in what is forcible eviction of the Palestinians. This is a horrific situation. And what really distresses me is the sheer lack of leadership from other liberal democracies on this issue. And
I think people are bored. I
I
think people are bored with it and focused on
they are. Maybe,
Alcatraz and the other shit coming out of the White House. But Robert, let me just ask you one thing, sort of specific that you can address rather than venting, which is our job. Is will this trip lead to Saudi Arabia joining the Abraham Accords, which of course is the set of agreements that, interestingly, came out of the first Trump presidency and included Morocco, Tunisia, I think, Bahrain, UAE, as recognizing Israel's right to exist. And Saudi Arabia was the hangout. And October the 7th was, in a sense, Hamas's attempt to blow up, potentially an attempt for Hamas to blow up Saudi Arabia joining the Abraham Accords. Can you see him getting MBS, Saudi Arabia, to join the Abraham Accords in the next week?
Not if we are to accept what MBS has been saying in public. Unless he does a dramatic U-turn in the presence of Mr. Trump when he visits Saudi Arabia and says, "Thanks, Mr. Trump, I couldn't see clearly until you arrived. Now I can see clearly," and it involves recognition of Israel. He gave, the Saudi government gave a very strong statement in response to Mr. Trump's initial statements, proposals about how Gaza would look, and the Riviera video that Trump put out at one point. Saudi Arabia was very critical of that, as was Qatar and the UAE, all close American allies. And Saudi Arabia in particular said there can be no normalization until there's political self-determination for the Palestinians, which is something that Mr. Netanyahu will never agree to. So he will never, on the face of it, it would appear that normalization goal is a long way from fruition. But we also know that Mr. Trump is putting a lot of store on Saudi Arabia's links with Putin, because MBS has very good relations with Mr. Putin. They're real buddies. They're both mass murderers, of course, but maybe it's a sort of solidarity, in that sort of thing. But I don't know. On the face of it, there's such a disconnect between what Trump seems to be expecting from this trip and from what the Saudi government has said is necessary to happen for relations to be normalized. And I don't think Qatar or UAE can also accept it. There is a point where these authoritarian regimes actually do fear their own people.
That's right. Well,
there's real strength of feeling in the Middle East.
There's only about, I think it's 160,000 Qataris. But the thing about that, I was thinking about this with this Gulf of Arabia idea, was it's only a few years, and again, I think we discussed this, it's within the range of the Hoon, that Saudi Arabia had cut off Qatar and was talking about building digging a trench around the whole country, the little nation of Qatar, because they didn't like Al Jazeera and Qatar being a bit uppity. This is, I can't see how the great deal maker can go in here and sort everything out. But like I said, would you expect him to go to Jerusalem too?
No, he said, Mr. Trump said in the last 24 hours he wasn't going to Israel on this trip. And I'm wondering if he's got an unpleasant surprise for Israel.
So the other thing I'm curious about, Robert, is this idea that Israel is going to push the Palestinians out of Gaza, and a lot of that will land on Egypt.
Precisely.
Whether this will destabilize the region and
Yeah.
the relative standoff there's been between Israel and Egypt over the years, and whether the Egypt, just under the weight of pressure, in the same way that the Syrian civil war created so much pressures in its neighbours, not to mention Europe, whether this cascades into the rest of the region.
Well, Egypt has very steadfastly kept its border closed, and you could say that Egypt has been part of the problem so far, because they could have acted as a conduit to get humanitarian aid into Gaza. There's been an absolute blockade for 7 weeks.
And they tried, but they are absolutely determined not
Yes,
to create
because they
that,
do not want
vent.
they do not want the depopulation of Gaza. And so I think this is setting America up for a collision with Egypt if they pursue this idea, or at least do not have any objection to Israel basically creating a greater Israel at the expense. We're not just talking about Gaza. Don't lose sight of the West Bank. They've said they're going to annex it this year, and there's 4 million people there. Where are they going to go? And we're talking 2 million in Gaza. You see,
God gave Israel Judea and Samaria. We know that.
Yes. So,
sorry, that was a very dangerous provocation, which yeah.
So, just on this issue of the Middle East and how it's connected up with the conflict in between Russia and the Ukraine, in particular Russia's role. How are we going there with that so-called, I will stop the war within a day of being president, and Putin will do the right thing because I'm mates with Putin. How's that going? At what point does Trump say, actually, I've just worked out that Putin doesn't stick to his deals, even though I've been told this for years by everyone else who's actually dealt with him?
Oh, I don't think Mr. Trump will say that. I think he will say he's disappointed with the progress, or something quite sort of general. Although I was interested in Mr. Vance's comments, where he's saying that Putin's asking for too much, basically. Well, of course he is. He's illegally invaded a country, and the United States should be upholding the rules. But it's not. It's been gutless and cowardly and weak. So, in a sense, it's siding with the aggressor against the victim of aggression, and it's effectively not learning historical lessons. After all, Britain tried appeasement with Hitler, and that worked well, didn't it? They had to ended up with war. But yeah, I mean, I think my understanding is that Mr. Trump is having a one-to-one meeting with Mr. Putin very shortly. Was it on the 15th or the 16th of May?
Yes, and we wonder what will happen in that meeting. The first one was just absolutely
the one in Helsinki,
yeah,
with no one present but the interpreters, which caused the State Department a great deal of angst.
Yeah.
But to answer your question, I think the Trump peace plan is with all its concessions to Putin is basically dead. Zelensky can't accept it, and the Europeans won't accept it. And it'll be interesting to see now that Merz is finally in place, how this shapes up, because he immediately visited France and also Poland.
One would have to say, Robert, that Zelensky has now, having had that awful sort of boarding school beating up in the Oval Office,
which was appalling.
Which was appalling, has actually played a blinder by being able to sign that agreement that may never lead to anything about the war.
I think he's outmaneuvered both Putin and Trump. And you might say, well, that's not too difficult. After all, Mr. Putin was repeatedly warned by his own military never to invade Ukraine. So there must be a bit of tooth grinding going on in Moscow at the moment. It's been an absolute catastrophe for Russia. War
Robert,
in
people are asking on the chat, and they're right, and I did flag this with you. And in fact, I think it's something you mentioned a little bit earlier, and certainly you and I talked about earlier today as we were unbelievably to people on the pod that we actually do have the odd chat ahead of time in order to line you up for a few of things. Kashmir and this confrontation between India and Pakistan. My sense of it is that they are, and not to sound too Rory Stewartish, is that they are, everything at the moment is proportional. But what's your view?
I think it is, but it has the potential for miscalculation to occur. A lot of people in the Western world are assuming they're using the Cold War model of mutual assured destruction between the Soviet Union, what used to be the Soviet Union, and the United States, and how both superpowers were very careful to avoid getting into a head-on conflict situation because they both had nuclear weapons. Now, Pakistan and India are, of course, constrained by their mutual possession of nuclear weapons, but the issue is not an ideological divide. The issue dividing them is they both claim sovereignty over the same territory, which is Kashmir, which is a very valuable territory. It's agriculturally rich and fertile, and also is strategically important because it borders both Afghanistan and China. And there is an enormous sense, at least on the Pakistani side, of injustice. And when I'm not sure that the model of mutual assured destruction can be applied in the same way that it was between the Soviet Union and the United States. In short, I think this situation is much more fraught, and could, if this tit-for-tat military exchanges, which both sides seem to be careful, they don't want nuclear war.
No, that's what I mean. It seems to have been at the moment a little. We'll kill 28 of your people in what we've decided as a terrorist hub. It's been very modest so far. But Robert, I think also for this audience, would it be useful to just go back to 1947 and ask ourselves who left Kashmir as a little unexploded bomb north of?
Well, Britain's left some unexploded bombs in lots of places in the world, not least. I've been appalled by the fact that the Starmer government seems to have washed its hands of a situation involving Israel and the Palestinians, which it bears some historical responsibility for. But coming to the point, yes, the British were broke after the Second World War. They had to leave the Indian subcontinent rather quickly, and they used the rather imprecise mechanism of saying to regional princes or maharajas that you should opt whether you should either decide to join a secular India or an Islamic Pakistan. And of course the system worked in a ramshackle sort of way, but when it came to Kashmir it really broke down because the Hindu prince decided to join India rather than Pakistan, despite the fact that 60% of the population which he ruled over was
Muslim and wanted to. It's so interesting, isn't it? And it's. I was thinking for some reason the other night I had a conversation about Louis Mountbatten, who of course was the governor of India at that time. What was he called? The Viscount. What was he called? Jesus, what was his title when he was running India in those last years? And of course
Viceroy.
Viceroy. I'm sorry, not Viscount. It's an aircraft, of course.
Same difference.
Yeah, but he dashed out of there as fast as you can, and his legacy is quite extraordinary when you think about the sort of apparently he was not terribly good at Crete. Mountbatten is a very interesting figure in this. I think there's probably one or two books in your shelf behind about Mountbatten,
possibly.
Or the legacy, at least.
So just moving on to what's happening with New Zealand's situation in this contest between China and the United States. What I found interesting this week, particularly in the wake of the Canadian and the Australian election results, and both Canada and Australia have been quite robust in pushing back at Trump on China, so, on trade, and have been very much, we're going to chart our own path here within reason. Australia still is committed to a very close defence relationship, and in theory is going to spend tens of billions, maybe hundreds of billions of dollars on some submarines they may never see. But what did you think of the criticism of the likes of Helen Clark, of Malcolm Turnbull, that our politicians seem to be remarkably quiet and supine on this issue of whether to stand up to Trump as a bully?
Yes, I watched the Malcolm Turnbull interview with great interest, and I happen to agree with him. I think that New Zealand can be both cooperative on issues where it agrees with the Trump administration, but also not pull any punches when it disagrees. And we certainly disagree on free trade, and we certainly disagree with the fact that Trump is undermining the rules-based order by threatening to invade other liberal democracies. And we should not make any apologies for standing up on those issues. I think many Kiwis are disappointed on that issue. And the idea that you stay beneath the radar and you won't become a target, well, actually, as Turnbull pointed out, that doesn't work with a bully, because a bully interprets such disciplined silence as acceptance, even complicity in the bully's plans. And, it was very interesting listening to Turnbull, because he recounted his first meeting with Mr. Trump, which was an explosive one. And he sort of said that with someone like Mr. Trump, you do, I think it was Henry Kissinger once said, good politicians must always be capable of the odd tantrum. And
or constant tantrums.
I think Turnbull had his timely tantrum, and Trump got the message. But creeping around Trump and telling him what a wonderful guy when he already thinks that doesn't really achieve very much anyway.
Yeah. Which did you think? My sense, Robert, was that Mark Carney played it rather brilliantly the other day, because he was not a sycophant, and he was clear. And then he went and did his press conference.
Also, I thought that line when he said certain things are not for sale.
Yeah.
Was a masterpiece. And look, this guy, he is a very smart guy. He's
Do you know, Robert, that Bernard and I have sold this show to Marlboro, and we're going to be to Philip Morris, and we're going to be advertising vapes, and snooze on here very soon.
Well, I don't think my daughters will allow me to appear on here again.
No. This is news to me, but anyway.
But I agree. I think Carney was actually. It was interesting watching Mr. Trump. The other thing I loved about Carney is that he didn't hesitate to factually correct Mr. Trump.
Yes.
On two occasions, particularly over when Mr. Trump was talking about how America was subsidizing Canada, which he would had none of. And you are talking about someone who's got a PhD from Oxford in economics. So I think, and he's got a track record in policy, the real world in policy practice. He was governor of the Bank of England, and by all accounts did a very good job.
Well, but just going back, forgive me. Just going back to the thing that Bernard asked you, and I was struck listening to the wireless this morning of Winston Peters' comment when a very good RNZ person asked him about Albanese and Carney. He said 2 words: Nigel Farage. Sorry, he didn't speak it with a sort of Cockney accent, but.
Nigel Farage hasn't got a Cockney accent.
I know. Other
than the one that
he went to Dulwich School, as we know.
He's privately school educated, and he lives, from the British point of view, he was one of the, if you want to use British vernacular, he was one of the toffs.
Yes,
and he's pretending to be like Mr. Trump. He puts on his baseball cap, he goes down the pub, lifts a pint with the lads, and pretends to be one of them, but he's not. He's a performer. Yeah,
but. What I mean is, of course, that is the UK local elections plus a by-election went very strongly towards reform.
Sure.
Why is the UK an outlier? And I'm sorry, I'm asking, as usual, military historian, historical historian, war historian.
2 quick points, Peter.
Yeah.
First of all, more people do not vote in British local elections than do vote. And I think that's important. And secondly, the Conservative Party has collapsed under its new leader. And quite frankly, I'm not trying to diminish the Reform Party's achievement, which is considerable. They've surged into second place, or they've got 32% of the vote or whatever. But once people start realising, and I think Mr. Starmer, or certainly once somebody close to him, will start making the connections for the British people, because there's huge complaints about the cost of living. One of the biggest contributors to Britain's cost of living crisis was Brexit. Oh, and who was the mastermind of Brexit? It was Mr.
Boris Johnson.
Wow.
Well, no, Farage.
I know.
He was the key architect.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, of course, Johnson jumped on that bandwagon.
I definitely think Winston Peters has got his long distance political analysis wrong in this case, because his suggestion is that we should all just keep a little bit quiet because look,
We
the,
must, yeah.
the right will win in the end, just like they are in the UK. That's not the case.
They're not winning in the UK.
No. The reason
Well,
is the Conservatives are
hang on,
losing,
you
and
two.
so is Labor, because Labor has adopted a Blairite debt reduction, cut benefits approach, which actually the public don't want and don't like, unlike what we saw in Australia, where the Australian government has been running a sensible budget policy, including rebates for people to help them with the cost of living, and unemployment is low and falling there, below ours. So I think the cost of living and jobs and those sorts of things matter. And Peter Dutton really was an Australian version of Trump, but without the charm. And I think Winston Peters is wrong on this, but we'll see. It's been wonderful to see you, Rob.
Thank
you so much for coming on.
Pleasure.
And we look forward to seeing you.
Christ, I had 62 other questions for him about things like, his model train set and Scalextrics and what he thought of the Oscar Piastri victory in Formula One this weekend at Me Up Miami.
Well, we shall look
Another
forward to
day.
this for another day, another 7 podcasts. Peter, thank you, and Robert, thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Melissa, it's great to see you, and I know almost nothing about the topic which you're going to talk about with Bernard, and which will not prevent me from interjecting from time to time. So please go ahead.
So we're really lucky to have you on, Melissa Ansell Bridges, who is the secretary of the CTU and has been heavily involved in the negotiations at various points over recent years around the pay equity agreements. What happened this week in Parliament and in Wellington?
Yes. What happened? Okay, so Tuesday morning we found out that there was an imminent announcement from the minister with regards to pay equity. We'd sort of heard rumblings that they might want to be looking at something related to the Act, and we all watched the announcement eagerly, and it was just so much worse than what we could have imagined. There were some areas which were sort of predictable. We knew that they were going to want to mess with things like comparators, for example, but things like the cancellation of review clauses, that was new, didn't see that coming. Things like adjusting the thresholds, that was worse than expected. So there were some things in there that were really quite surprising. I mean, cancelling all of the claims that are currently being negotiated was a devastating blow.
But Melissa, they can come back, right? They can come back under the new terms if they've got the resources and so on to pitch it. But
sure, in theory, yeah. Yes, in theory they could, but also, like, let's be really clear about what that involves now. Actually, a lot of those claims won't meet the new threshold in terms of the percentage of women in the industry. So there are a lot of female-dominated industries who aren't going to meet that 70% threshold. So some will, but some won't be able to. And like, there's 33 claims, right? So it's a lot of people. We're talking about over 300,000 working New Zealanders, vast majority New Zealanders, but there are men in these female-dominated industries too. But of those 33 claims, there are some that won't meet that threshold now. So some will be able to come back, some won't be able to come back. But then once you've met that threshold, right, they've now made it harder to actually initiate claims.
And Melissa, just to take this back to, because I feel the reporting in this has not been terribly clear. I did listen to Brooke Van Velden trying to explain this, but when you say that these are often women-dominated jobs, that is presumably why the Employers Federation the other day was talking about this weird, it's very hard or it seems illogical sometimes to compare jobs with jobs because they're women-dominated careers. So that's not just it's a bit of a furphy to say you can't compare a person doing that particular job with another job because it's a job that blokes do. Is that right?
Yeah, the comparators issue is really interesting. So I'm happy to jump in and start and talk about that in a little bit more detail. I have found the reporting on it hasn't gone into great detail on this, but I actually also think that the minister has been willing to not explain this fully because it benefits her argument. Because when she's saying, and I can't remember the exact examples that she gave, but sort of, librarians have been comparing themselves to mechanical engineers or whatever one of the examples was that she gave. What isn't happening in this process is librarians are not saying we do the exact same work as mechanical engineers and therefore we must be paid the exact thing that mechanical engineers pay.
Which is a really good piece of misinformation to throw in there.
Yes, it is, isn't
Oh
it?
yeah, they're not lawyers. Yeah. Cleaners are not lawyers.
Yeah, come on, isn't that ridiculous? And these people have been comparing themselves to these people, and clearly that's evidence of the system not working. No, that's not what is happening. What is happening with the comparator process? Like this, the comparator process is one of the really good things about the system that we have in New Zealand, or had in New Zealand. So this is about actually doing like a decent study of the work itself. So it's going, okay, so what does a librarian do? Actually, what are the duties involved? What are their responsibilities? What are their qualifications? And librarians have qualifications. They're actually highly skilled and trained. It's difficult work, and they know what they're doing. But you've got like responsibilities, duties, experience, training. What are the risks involved in their work as well? And doing like a complex study of all of that. And they do that by interviewing hundreds of workers in the profession as well, right? It's not someone sitting down and looking at a JD. It's going, actually, what is the work that this person actually does on a day-to-day basis? You do that with the job that is the subject of the claim, but then you also do it with a couple of other industries, and you say, okay, well, how does this compare when we're talking about the kinds of qualifications that librarians have versus these other jobs?
Well, and as you say, the expectations of training and so on, which does then make them comparable. It's not that you're saying that a librarian is comparable to a nuclear physicist, except that they might have 3 years of degree,
also
learning the Dewey system.
A part of that process is trying to make visible what is often invisible in female-dominated industries, right? There's a lot of the work, and it's real work. It's a real part of the job in those women-dominated industries that isn't valued because it isn't seen, because it's dismissed as like, oh, they're just women, so of course they're good at being compassionate, or of course they're good at like doing the caring stuff, and it's kind of dismissed because it's viewed as like,
it comes naturally to them.
Yeah. So Melissa, I'm curious to know, because they can make arguments about comparators and fairness. It's a brutal attempt to carve anything up to $4 billion a year out of their budget and to stop 300,000 people from getting big pay increases that they consider other taxpayers shouldn't pay them because they don't deserve it. What's been the reaction, not just in the labour movement, but amongst the 300,000? That's not a small number. 300,000 people. A bunch of them will have voted at National New Zealand First and ACT. What are you hearing out there?
I can't adequately capture the rage. It's so deeply felt. There is this deep fury at the injustice of how this has happened. The fact that it's been rushed through, the fact that it is like very evidently about the budget, the fact that there are people who have been working and pouring a lot of themselves into these claims. Like I said, there are people who are interviewed, they contribute meaningfully to these claims. They're not sitting around waiting for somebody else to do it for them, right? They are a meaningful part of this work. And they've been doing that for years and years and years, waiting for like what can be quite a complex and sometimes slow and sometimes frustrating process. And then sometimes those processes have been slowed down because the government's dragged their feet about funding and stuff like that. And they've been waiting, and some of them were getting really close as well. And then to have the rug pulled out from underneath them, the devastation, like I cannot adequately capture the rage that these women righteously are feeling. But anybody else that's been involved with it, anybody else that's like close to people who are working in these industries, feel that same sort of sense of frustration. But then you've also got people who have been working on this issue for a really long time, people who have been doing this since the 70s, since the 60s, trying to push for pay equity. And it is, there's that classic protest sign of like, I can't believe I'm still having to protest this shit.
Yeah.
And it's like that. But then we thought that we'd got there. But no, actually, we haven't. We've gone backwards again. Okay, well, I guess we're still doing this. Like, there is absolutely a sense of determination, but frustration, like maybe a bit of surprise at how it's happened. But then also, I think, at least within the Labour movement, there has been a real sense that this is a government, this is a workplace relations minister who shows active disdain for working people. So maybe there's not that much surprise.
Tell me about that. Brooke Van Velden is obviously a key player here, but Nicola Willis and Erica Stanford, to a lesser extent, both spoke passionately in favour of the pay equity legislation at the time. And Brooke Van Velden, what's going on here? Has ACT managed to colonise the centre of the centre-right? And is Christopher Luxon allowing these guys to grab the wheel?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. Yeah, I went back and I had a read. I think the Spin-off did a piece with some of the quotes from all these women MPs, all these national women MPs from when it was passed, talking about how proud they were for their daughters, blah, 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 and then, neck minute. And I can't help but thinking that, Brooke Van Velden's made it very clear that this was the thing that she said to Christopher Luxon at the start that she wanted to do. When she first
really?
Yeah, she said that this was, she sort of laid out what her hope was in this portfolio. But the buck stops with Christopher Luxon. Like, sure, Brooke Van Velden might have driven this, and maybe if she didn't, it wouldn't have happened. But it didn't have to happen just because she wanted it to. This is Nicola Willis and Christopher Luxon deciding that this is a thing that will be allowed to happen. And for something this fundamental, this big to be happening, like that absolutely is that's a captain's call from the Prime Minister to have allowed this to happen. But also, this is also a budget issue. So I think that there's an element of they probably didn't have much of a choice in the end. I think they've got themselves into this sticky situation with these tax cuts, which they were never able to afford. We spent a lot of the last election campaign saying, hey, these guys cannot afford what they're saying they're going to do. And it's going to mean cuts to public services. And it has, and those cuts to public services have gone way further than they said that they would. But then there's still a gap, and now they're filling it with, off the back of these, some of the lowest paid and most vulnerable women workers. So I think that Brooke Van Velden presented a potential solution to a problem which Nicola Willis and Christopher Luxon, needed, and they're very willing for her to front on this because it's actually not a good
and
look.
She's done it very skillfully.
Well, and she's done it very enthusiastically as well, hasn't she? She's and it's not going to cost ACT politically. This will not impact ACT's base, but I suspect it will cost National because
this is what I'm. This is yet again a pincer movement. Melissa, may I ask, because I'm looking at our comments from our audience. They're really interested in this, and I may be the most ignorant person both on this podcast and presenting the podcast. Could you explain? The Act really affects mostly state employees, is that correct? But it then has a huge ripple effect into the private sector, is that correct?
Yeah.
That's why this has the opportunity to save them so much money. Because again, sometimes these contextual things are not very well explained.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So the Act itself doesn't target the public sector. But all of the claims that have been successful so far have been public sector claims. Some of those are in the funded sector, so like care and support, for example. Some of them are more sort of core services. There was one claim that I believe had just been lodged or was just about to be lodged, which is the first private sector claim, and that was for vet nurses. So another female-dominated industry, but in the private sector. And so the public sector was the first sort of area where these claims really got off the ground. And that's for a bunch of reasons, including the fact that actually resourcing doing these claims is very
Yes.
labor intensive. And so a lot of it basically requires a union to do it. The Act doesn't actually, but actually in practice, it's usually a union that needs to do it, to have the resource to do it. And that generally then lends itself to those public sector unions. It's also more straightforward to try and do the coordination piece in the public sector. So the Act doesn't require it, but for a bunch of reasons, it has been in the public sector that this has mostly happened. And then obviously anything that happens in the public sector has a flow-on effect to private sector in terms of wages.
Yeah, it was just it was unclear to me in most of the reporting that I read about exactly why it would save the government money. So I do appreciate it, and I want to come back and ask Bernard this. But Melissa, am I right in thinking that you are in fact the 2025 version of Tom Skinner?
Tom Skinner?
Yeah, who was the head of the FOL, Federation of Labour.
That's a long time ago. You're
I
exposing
know,
your age.
but I am exposing my age.
Would have been before I was born, Peter.
Tom Skinner
Exactly,
was
but there's
the
I know
Federation
there's
of
going to be
Labour well before the CTU. But anyway.
there's going to be very many
Yeah.
people on the thing who just say, "Oh, Jesus Christ, he knows Tom. You knew Tom Skinner. I did. Yeah."
No. Yeah.
No.
So
You seem like a
around
much more reasonable person than Tom Skinner used to be.
So the CTU has been around since '88, and we obviously were amalgamated FOL and the public sector unions.
Yeah.
So
No,
Melissa, stay on while I ask Bernard another question here.
Yeah.
So Bernard, if you don't mind,
Sure.
I know you've probably got dinner coming, but Bernard sometimes does what we call what I started calling, and he's now kidnapped it, a soliloquy. Bernard, you really wanted to discuss this subject because you think it's a bit lousy. Could you explain the economics behind it, about the implications for the budget and why you think it's a bit lousy? Is that all right? And then Melissa
Sure.
can interject and I'll bugger off.
So this has been done to save the government billions, it says. We don't know exactly, but the Treasury bucket, which identifies where this comes from, is the unallocated operating contingencies, which over the next 4 years was budgeted back in the budget in May last year at $17 billion. That's, not coincidentally, just a little bit more than the $14 billion for the tax cuts. This government, with this action, is passing retrospective legislation under urgency that rips up effectively contracts or promises that a previous national government helped commit to. And we included in today's kaka a lovely picture of Christine Bartlett and a Mr. Coleman, a Minister of Labour at the time, signing that agreement. I listened to those speeches in Parliament from Nicola Willis and Erica Stanford. And when I saw this, I thought, who swallowed the dead rat here? But then, of course, Nicola Willis had to feed herself the dead rat because of her commitment to the budget rules. And this, I think, because it alienates such a wide swathe of what you call middle New Zealand. I perhaps a little insultingly describe this group as the netball mums. The netball mums of New Zealand, I think, will see this and think, that's not fair. That's not right. That's going to hurt. My mum in the aged care centre is going to struggle now because those people looking after her are going to be less well paid. The people I know working 2 or 3 jobs are going to be less well paid. And why? So landlords with 20 houses can get that little bit more and they can have a sea legs instead of a basic boat. It just looks mean. And the thing about this is that it's quite in contrast to the previous national government under John Key, Bill English, and and actually signed that deal and helped vote through that original pay equity legislation, they knew where the centre was. They knew when they were making big tax changes that they had to at least pretend and try to make it distributionally neutral. That's what the tax switch was. These guys, right from the start, didn't even pretend. This was shifting money from poor people who can't afford it to rich people who don't need it. This pay equity deal was never talked about in the election, and essentially it is one of the darkest fruits of the government ceding control of large parts of the cabinet to an extremist party who most national voters didn't want to see in and didn't need to be there, because Christopher Luxon didn't need to give them all of those cabinet positions. I think this is the moment, in a similar way to Labor's Auckland COVID shutdown moment, when suddenly a big chunk of the population saw this and thought, that doesn't feel right. That's not right. I don't like this. And I think come the polls, and they've already been quite weak for the government in recent months, people are going to see that the National Party has tied itself, has lashed itself to ACT, and is going down because it is now the nasty party. In the same way that the National Party from 1990 to at least 1993 was seen as the nasty party. And the common line between that National Party in 1990 to 1993 was an approach to the budget, which you could argue back then was necessary. You know, the government and the nation was in fiscal strife, and things needed to be done. Now, I disagree with what was done and how it was done, but you could argue then there was some sort of crisis to deal with. Painting our current fiscal situation and our debt situation as a crisis is just plain ludicrous and financially wrong. Ask any bond fund manager and ratings agency manager, and they will say to Nicola Willis and Ian Rennie, the Treasury Secretary, bullshit. And they'll do it by offering 4 times the amount of bonds that are being sold in each auction. And I think that this week, the government guaranteed itself at least a very tough fight at the next election, and will probably lose it. And I think it's the moment when, in the next few weeks, as the netball mums get in touch with their national MPs and go, what's going on here? Why are you letting Brooke Van Velden? Why are they letting Brooke Van Velden and David Seymour, those dickheads, run this government, which I thought was a centrist, sensible
Bernard,
government?
before I ask Melissa to come in and comment on your soliloquy, because she's a very rare guest that's been allowed to stay on while you talk your stream of consciousness or unconsciousness. No, in this case, it's a stream of consciousness. But Bernard, you think this will also actually add up to a positive for ACT and a negative for National, right?
Yeah, maybe at the margins, but it doesn't matter. And in a way, it didn't matter when the government was formed. ACT didn't matter when the government was formed. It was never going to join Labor and create a government. And National did not understand that it had the power to marginalise ACT. Instead, Christopher Luxon chose, for his own reasons, time. I want to be Prime Minister a week or two earlier, and to be nice and have a supposed united coalition government. And this is something that John Key and Bill English did not do. And they did not hand the keys to ACT last time. Now, ACT had a few more MPs this time, but it wasn't unnecessary. And the same with New Zealand First. At Labor, unlike back in 2009, New Zealand First had a real option of joining Labor. This was never the case this time. And so I think this is the ultimate fruit of that bad piece of political decision-making, bad judgment by Christopher Luxon. And the reason is he has bad judgment and he doesn't connect to New Zealanders.
But he's coming on next week, right?
Melissa, I keep asking, it hasn't happened. No.
Would you please just respond? Because we very seldom have guests on at this point where Bernard is, but I thought yours was particularly relevant to this, since you are the Tom Skinner of 2025.
Look, I feel very privileged to have been allowed to stay on. I completely agree, Bernard, particularly with your political analysis about what this means for the next election. I think the election campaign's just started. There's no one that I've spoken to who's involved in this space who hasn't already connected the dots to the election next year. People are already looking ahead, like, what do we do? The only thing no one expects to be able to convince them really otherwise to go back, because we know the reasons that they've made this decision. So and like, obviously we're going to try and convince them of the fact that this is a horrific mistake and they need to reverse it. But if they're not going to do it ahead of the election, then we're just going to have to replace them with somebody who will. And everybody who is angry about this is joining those dots. And I think you're absolutely right that, we have been approached by a number of community groups, a number of really prominent women in New Zealand who have also been working on this for a long time. There's a lot of dames who are really annoyed at this. And there's a lot of women who are from the, business perspective as well, who, they might come from, a different place politically to the union movement, but they are feminist and they have a sense of fairness when it comes to the stuff. And they were really happy to see the pay equity legislation passed, and they're really pissed about what has happened now. And they are absolutely going to be lending their voices to this fight as well. I mean, I completely agree that, National did not have to do this. They have, they've chosen.
You mean National did not have to do the coalition, or did not have to do this, what they've done yesterday?
Well, no, I mean, I agree with Bernard with your analysis about like how much they gave away to act in the coalition negotiations, but they didn't have to make the changes that they did. I mean, maybe from a fiscal perspective to balance.
There's no good fiscal reason.
That is only
for it.
because of other choices that they have made themselves as well, right? And I think that you're absolutely right that they've just bought themselves a massive fight at the next election. I know a lot of people from a lot of different corners of New Zealand who are coming out, who are getting in touch with us and saying, how do we help? What do we do? We're wanting to do this. We've got this idea for this action. Everyone is mobilized by this idea because of the anger that's been felt, and there's no way that goes away before the election.
Thank you
Melissa,
very much,
thank
Melissa.
you so much, and thank you so much, Bernard. But thank you so much. Thank you, Melissa, and I apologise for calling you Tom Skinner, but I know you'll look it up. I was also looking up a chap called Bill Anderson. So this is. I am feeling about.
Peter was a reporter in the press gallery in 1984, 5, 6. Is that right?
81, 82, 83.
Oh my goodness!
Yeah. And I'm going to tell you a very funny story as our skateboarding dog, which I'm going to go. But Melissa, thank you so much for doing that. And
Thanks
go and
very
have some
much.
din-dins, please.
See you later.
See you later.
So Bernard, I've decided to change my skateboarding dog from the one that I had, which is a little tiny, very brief, because Simon's saying we need to get on with it because TVNZ's ratings are collapsing as usual when we go on a bit, which is to remember Bob Jones. And I interviewed him a couple of times when I was a baby. And now when I look at pictures of myself in 1980 or 81, when I did interview him, I just think, oh my God. And I went to his launch of the New Zealand party at, I think, the Wellington Town Hall. And we were having a little chat before he went in with other reporters. And I mentioned, for some reason, about Henry Kissinger having got the Nobel Prize for bombing Cambodia. And it went straight into Bob Jones's speech. And he sort of gave me a little thumbs up. But anyway, it is just so bonkers that he's gone. And I also worked with Lloyd, his brother, who he seemed to, they got on well, but he didn't seem to respect Lloyd's amazing literary talents. Anyway, that's my skateboarding dog, is Bob Jones. Former
brothers,
the late Bob Jones.
Who both made huge impacts in different ways in different places. Peter, thank you very much. Sorry, Simon, we've gone on way longer than we expect.
I know.
There'll be some slashing and burning.
He doesn't like not having his sandwiches in the morning. His breakfast, his bratwurst.
We shall see you all later. Ka kite anō. See you later next week.
Thank you, everybody. Bye-bye. Thank you.